Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China and the World program here at Columbia University. Our event tonight is with a special friend of our program who's spoken for us more than once. She is Roselyn Hsueh from Temple University, where she's an associate professor of political science, and she co-directs a certificate in political economy. And she's also a faculty affiliate of global studies and Asian studies at Temple University. Rosie is a longtime friend of China and the World from back when we were at Princeton. And she is an expert on state capitalism and globalization and the intersection of international relations and comparative political development in various countries, including China. She's done lots of in-depth research all around the world. And today she's going to speak to us about globalization and China and India. And the title of her talk is Micro-Institutional Foundations of Capitalism, Sectoral Pathways to Globalization in China and India. Rosie, we're really very happy to have you back. And we were flattered that you wanted to speak for us again. And welcome, and we'll have Q&A after Professor Hsueh speaks. And you please use the Q&A function on your Zoom to send in the questions. Now over to you, Rosie.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Christensen, Tom, for the introductions. And indeed, it is such an honor to be back here and to have the opportunity to share findings from my forthcoming book. It's coming out from Cambridge University Press at the end of May, early June. It's now available, I have to do this plug, available for pre-order, paperback and hardcover on Amazon and the CUP website. So
I'm going to wait for the movie, Rosie.
Be interested.
I'm going to wait for the movie.
Nothing we do in academia, unfortunately, is that exciting, but it is available to pre-order if people are interested. Yeah, it's such an honor to be back here, and I'm excited to get reactions and feedback about this work I've been working on. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start my PowerPoint presentation. I hope you guys can see it. So here I just want to talk a little bit about the cover of the book. The book is, the cover is basically here, a photo of fabric production process by a power loom actually in Gujarat, India. And so, you know, as you could tell by the title of the book, Sectoral Pathways to Globalization, sectors and sectoral structures, organization of institutions will factor as an important part of my theoretical framework. All the same, I also emphasize ideas, objective and intersubjective views about, you know, importance of about ideas of political legitimacy and national security and so forth as states interact and respond to internal and external pressures. So the framework will be about, you know, state level ideas and identities and values as they interact with sectoral structures and organization of institutions. So, you know, I couldn't cover all countries in the book cover, so decided on here an image of the power loom in India. So, you know, as Professor Christensen have mentioned, the book is based on in-depth research in these countries under study. And so what I always like to do and begin with in my book talk is I like to kind of show images from the field. And here what I have on the left side is a bookstore in right outside the Red Square in Moscow. And then here on the bottom right is a photo of, you know, a bookstore of a bunch of books in right out in Wangfujing in China. And then right above is actually a very recent photo because I just returned to the United States from a trip to Delhi. And this is actually a photo of the India Habitat Center in central Delhi. Right now, as we speak, as I speak, there's actually an exhibit going on right now of about state building actually in Brazil, in Delhi. And so here what we have are images of the countries under study, China, India, and Russia, and really countries kind of interested in understanding each other, understanding these large, emerging powers, regional powers, and global powers, and understanding, well, what actually make these countries motivate these countries' behaviors. And as I do in my book, I draw in the macro level and the micro level industrial interactions. And so I just thought that wanted to show you really kind of coming to life and some of the questions that are being broached in this book. So the motivation behind the book is that, everyone assumes that there's this model to explain transition economies in the context of global economic integration. And by global economic integration, I'm speaking specifically of the post-Cold War collapse of the Soviet Union, 1990s and beyond global economic integration for these three large developing countries. For China, it was after Tiananmen, and after the around the time of 1990, 92, when Deng Xiaoping took his southern tour to the eastern coastal areas. And then for India, it was, 1990 marked also a time of external globalization, integration into the global economy with Big Bang globalization. So everyone assumes there's some sort of model to explain this transition. And the assumption is that there are national level, linear and unitary globalization trajectories. What I do in this book is I build on my previous book on China's regulatory state, a new strategy for globalization. And what I do is I explore the analytical utility of taking my study cross-regionally, cross-nationally, and importantly to the industry and subsector. And the reason I do that is because complex interdependence of globalization has made it so that, countries' integration into the global economy is no longer about national level integration or national level interaction with each other. But what I argue in this book, that it's the interaction happens at the industry level, at the subsector level. I incorporate explanations that are about sub-regional variation. Obviously, for so many of us who study these countries, and particularly for the China scholars out there, there's a whole robust literature about subnational factors and subnational variation. And I will speak to that and how I integrate that into incorporate that into my sectoral level arguments. But what I do is, I marry the macro and the micro, and I examine that intersection between globalization and development at the national and sector specific levels. I compared these countries with similar timing in globalization, but also existing industrial bases, right? For all three countries, they're not developing countries starting necessarily from scratch. And so I examined from textiles to telecommunications, labor-intensive industries, and more capital-intensive industries. And I looked at how these three countries have globalized and developed. Another set of motivations I want to kind of mention before I move on to the study itself is, in comparative politics, we have increasingly more and more area study specialists examining some of the findings of context specificity and the theories that come out of those findings, and how those findings could travel cross-nationally and cross-regionally. And so I follow in that kind of inspired by comparativists who have done that kind of work. And also just China specialists who have made claims that actually understanding China and scholarship on China can help us build theory in comparative politics, and also even IR. There's a robust literature in IR and at the intersection of IR and comparative, emphasizing ideas, norms, and identities, represented really by the scholarship of China and the World Program faculty and fellows and alumni. And so these scholars, Professor Christensen, Ian Johnston, the Chatterjee Miller and Mingye and others have really provided inspiration for the work I'm doing here, which is to take a kind of a theoretical framework that come out of my earlier work and testing it and building onto it and refining it, and to understand that kind of this age of globalization and what it means for other large developing countries of comparable size. Okay, so now I finally will then reach into introducing the kind of the empirical research puzzles of the book. As I mentioned already, these three countries have liberalized their economies. They joined the WTO, were existing members of the WTO, such as India, in the 1990s and beyond. They have appeared to depart from the East Asian developmental state. Now, there is debate out there whether China is an example of a state-led model. In my existing works, I have made the argument that indeed China has departed from the East Asian developmental state. And I make that argument because unlike the East Asian developmental state, China, globalizing in the neoliberal era, have actually been quite liberal with foreign direct investment. China has, on the very macro level, liberalized FDI. But as my work has also shown, China has re-regulated and has re-regulated at the micro-sectoral level to promote domestic industry, but beyond just developmental goals, but also goals for political legitimacy, goals for national security applications, and so forth. And so this is also true for India and Russia. All the other two economies have been quite open and liberal in this age of globalization. In their macro liberalization, they have also departed from that other kind of iconic model of development, the historical experience of Latin America, which scholars have found historically been exploited by coalitions of FDI and local interests. For India, Russia, and China, we find that some of the re-regulation that has occurred has actually aided and abated state goals and also state-society relations as well. And so in that sense, these three countries are not like the East Asian developmental state, nor are they like the Latin American model. And so how do we explain the re-regulation? And what I do in this book is I proffer a framework to understand so. But quickly, I just want to show you just data from 1980. These countries are not open to FDI, and in fact, Russia is not even it's part of the Soviet Union, so we don't even have data at that time. You fast forward 15 years, we see these countries are being much more open to FDI, even more so than the United States, more so than East Asian developmental state, traditional Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and then in 2015, again, these countries continue to be quite open to foreign direct investment here with percentage of as a percentage of GDP. Cross-time variation, they have kind of opened up, gone back and forth through the East Asian financial crisis, 2008 financial crisis, and to some extent have converged in terms of where they are in terms of openness to FDI as a percentage of GDP. Another measure of openness to the global economy, here export of goods and services. Again, all three countries are quite comparable in terms of that measure. As I've said, they have re-regulated and leading to distinct development outcomes. And so one measure of development outcome, not the only measure, one measure is science and technology patents. And here, is kind of the conventional wisdom, right? China is doing just so much better than India and Russia in terms of S&T. And here on this one measure on the macro level, that may appear to be true, but I also have data to show that, taking one of the industries that I study, that once we disaggregate the macroeconomy and once we go to the industry and subsector, we find that actually it really depends. That picture, the conventional wisdom of China just achieving S&T, well beyond the other two countries of comparable size, well, that gets demystified here we see that there's actually quite variation at the micro sector industry level. And this is what I do in the book, is to explain, well, how do we explain that? How do we explain the macro liberalization and the type of market governance patterns, government business relations that have emerged at the micro sectoral level? So some of the questions, what's the relationship between internal development and this integration into the global economy? How and why do state market relations differ? And do these differences matter for post-Cold War era of global conflict and cooperation? And certainly if I don't get to this last question, happy to answer questions about the implications of this study for international relations and so forth in the Q&A. So I want to kind of front load the arguments. I argue that market governance structures mediate this relationship between globalization and development. My strategic value framework theorizes that perceived strategic value of sector interacting with sectoral structures and organization of institutions will shape this national and within country sectoral patterns of market governance that I have mentioned. And resulting is this national configuration of sectoral models, right? We do still see national patterns, but they are a configuration of these sectoral differences within these countries. And that this national configuration of sectoral models will explain, or are the micro-institutional foundations of capitalism that will explain these countries' globalization trajectories. Okay. At the kind of more case-specific country and industry levels, my substantive findings are that China techno-security developmentalism has shaped bifurcated capitalism, and bifurcated capitalism looks like the centralization of governance of high-tech dual-use sectors and the decentralization of labor-intensive, less value-added ones. And for India, I have identified with the strategic value framework that neoliberal self-reliance shapes bifurcated liberalism, which centralizes the governance of small-scale rural sectors and decentralizes high-tech globally connected sectors. And for Russia, security resource nationalism shapes bifurcated oligarchy, I argue. And there we see the centralization of governance of infrastructure and resource sectors and the decentralization of labor-intensive, less value-added sectors. And what's really interesting in my findings is that these patterns, these kind of bifurcated patterns on the industry level based on strategic and non-strategic sectors for all three countries, really I'm able to trace across time to, to the beginnings of global economic integration, and then even kind of several decades since that initial opening to the global economy in this latest era of globalization. So what I'm going to do with the rest of my talk is I'm going to talk a little bit about research design methods, quickly about the conceptualization of market governance, and then I'm going to talk in more detail about the strategic value framework, the objective and intersubjective dimensions, and the interaction with sectoral characteristics. And then I will introduce the evidence from countries and sectors. Okay, so this book is based on a comparative case research design at different levels of analysis. I process trace from sectoral origins. So I actually, in the book, for each of the three countries, go back quite long historically. And by doing so, I begin at the sectoral origins, tracing how we see kind of the state level value-bounded rationality has stayed the same and also changed across time historically to today. So I have this historical chapter. And then I focus in the next two chapters of each country chapter, I at looking at the industrial trajectories from 1980 and beyond. And the reason I look at 1980 and beyond is because I want to look, before kind of that big bang globalization in the 1990s. And then I also want to look at the after picture too. So the before and after, and so I am able to trace across time the value bounded rationality that I claim about these national configurations of sectoral models. The work is based on semi-structured in-depth interviews and on-site visits in China, India, Russia, New York City, Silicon Valley, Washington, D.C., these global points where I could meet these different stakeholders in addition to being in country. I talked to key government, industry, company, and civil society stakeholders. By civil society, I'm namely talking about foreign delegations, business associations, industry associations, and the work is also substantiated by published and unpublished documentary evidence, descriptive statistics by governments, sector associations, and IOs, and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go over the market governance. This is the dependent variable of my study. And I have two dimensions here. I look at the level and scope of state and market coordination, and then also the distribution of property rights. And this allows me to look at market governance structures. And this dependent variable, or the conceptualization, allows me to form a map and taxonomy of market governance. And it allows me to systematically examine the national industry levels for all three countries, kind of provides, in a sense, this level playing field for me to systematically examine market governance structures. Happy to go into greater detail during Q&A about this, but essentially by extended scope of market coordination, I'm interested in identifying, the level of government. Is it central level, decentralized? Do we see mixed government authorities? Is this a bureaucracy, regulator, or some sort of government-sponsored or government-controlled bodies in terms of market governance of particular sectors? By distribution of property rights, I'm able to identify the controlling interest in any given sector, subsector, and market segment. And the reason it's important to look at the distribution of property rights is because, again, these three countries are socialist transitioning countries, right? Even India. They are countries that traditionally have held a lot of state-owned enterprises. But what we see in market governance today is that we're actually moving away from a lot of those traditional state-owned enterprises. They still exist. And why do they still exist? And why have countries privatized? And why do they vary at the industry level? By conceptualizing market governance, including distribution of property rights arrangements, I'm able to identify these differences in market governance and compare the three countries. And so as a result, we have kind of this typology of market governance. Again, I will go into greater detail in Q&A if people are interested in talking about this. But the idea is to map these types of market governance to the national and sector level. A nod to common forces of change. And this is where in the book, I discuss in great detail in chapter 2, but also in the case chapters, some of the dominant explanations how we can explain market governance patterns. And, some of the dominant perspectives in scholarship is open economy politics, subnational characteristics, historical legacies, regime type, right? That's a big one. China and Russia are authoritarian regimes. We have India, a democracy. And so what I do in the book is I make the argument that the perceived strategic value logic is first and foremost important in helping to explain these dominant patterns of market governance at the sector level. But that regime type reinforces and some of these dominant patterns. And reinforces, and also in response to internal and external pressures are when changes to or incremental changes to these dominant patterns can occur. And if you have an authoritarian regime, then some of those kind of more drastic changes or the beginnings of incremental change would be more likely to occur because of the regime type. Global norms, markets, and organizations, obviously, these countries are part of the WTO. They are integrated into the global economy. And so sectors are going to be exposed to markets and IOs. And so the way I treat these existing explanations is that I argue that these are common forces of change that all industries in these countries are affected by and have to respond to. But that in spite of these common forces of change, we see the strategic value logic at play. And so the strategic value framework. What I do here is I bridge materialist arguments with constructivism and historical institutionalism. And by doing so, I'm able to explicate patterns of market governance and do so in a systematic way to show why is it that these countries are varied in the dominant patterns of market governance. Why is it that on one hand, in the China case, for example, we have state capitalism, but on the other hand, we have almost a wild, wild west of capitalism, almost too much deregulation and lack of state capacity in certain sectors. Kind of the main dominant hypotheses are that the perceived strategic value of sectors as a function of how state elites face economic and political pressures will explain dominant sectoral patterns of market governance, and sectoral structures and organization of institutions will shape the market governance details. So in terms of perceived strategic value, I argue that there are political and economic dimensions. What would be conceived as strategic to state elites as they respond to internal and external pressures are going to be social and political stability and regime legitimacy. And we find that to be true regardless of regime type. External security and geopolitics are going to be of concern. And again, regardless of regime type, for example, in my India case, we find that what is considered strategic and will garner more state intervention, in particularly in certain sectors, in response to external security and geopolitical concerns, drive kind of the twists and turns of patterns of market governance. So as some of you probably know, there were some border disputes between India and China. India has been very open to foreign direct investment since Big Bang globalization, and particularly so even for Chinese foreign direct investment. But since the border disputes, India has actually added China to the list of countries that it will have to approve, that the very top level government will have to approve FDI coming in from China. And the only countries that are on that list are Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And so that would be an example of how even in a democratic regime, we find the perceived strategic value of certain industrial sectors being important as a function of the political dimension of what is considered strategic. On the economic dimension, we have kind of more developmental goals about national technology base, the economic growth and global competitiveness of industry. I make the argument that how perceived strategic value is viewed is perception. It's intersubjective, right? On the one hand, we have objective values, objective measures of the political and economic dimensions of strategic value. But on the other hand, it's important to think about the intersubjective dimension, the perception of what is considered strategic, regardless of more objective measures. And it's this intersubjectivity that will help us define and make claims upon and contest political economic pressures by state elites, then shaping market governance structures. Part of the strategic value framework is the sectoral structures and organization of institutions. This is important because telecommunications, capital intensivity, the fact that it's made of manufacturing and service industries, And even within services, you have basic services that's infrastructural, and then you have value-added services that operate on top of the infrastructural services. These are sectoral structures that really cannot be changed, whether you're in China, India, or Russia. And so as countries take into account the perception of strategic value, they will also have to account for sectoral structures. In terms of organization of institutions, the path dependency of these organization of institutions will matter, right? The fact that the Ministry of Textiles, really the only centralized ministry for textiles in the world today, exists in India, plays a role in explaining why, despite macro liberalization and India's attempts at export-oriented industrialization in the last couple decades, textiles today, in addition to the fact that it is very much part of, nationalist narratives about, India's independence from Great Britain, the idea of the role of Gandhi and cotton nationalism and so forth, those interacting national narratives and existing organization of institutions today explain why is it that textiles is today in India one of the most protected sectors still, and one of the most protected sectors in the global economy anywhere. And so that interaction of strategic value and sectoral logics are quite important to think about as we examine countries' globalization trajectories. Okay, so here I'm just kind of share with you some of the content or the scores on the interacting logics of strategic value and sectoral attributes. I've hinted at some of them already. I've talked about China and India. I want to talk a little bit about Russia. The conventional wisdom is that the fall of the Soviet Union led to Big Bang liberalization, macro liberalization, privatization, and so forth. But when you open the macro economy and take the study to the industry and sector level, what we find is that, in fact, the Russian government never actually privatized fixed line networks, never actually privatized infrastructural sectors, particularly in telecommunications. And that fact and centralization and reorganization of infrastructural sectors in telecommunications, since Putin came into power in 1998, 2000 and beyond, has allowed actually the Russian government, well now, first of all, to view telecommunications as quite strategic sector. But the fact that it was considered the inability to disconnect that from the military industrial complex of the earlier era has made it so that Russell Telecoms, a state-owned telecommunications service provider, now actually controls Russia's entire telecommunications infrastructure. In 1991, there was decentralization, and a lot of these state-owned infrastructure was held at the regional level, but they remained state-owned, and Putin over time was able to centralize and reorganize for all of these infrastructural sectors to become in state control and centralized. And so today, it enables and helps with the control of information dissemination, even though the value-added services operating on top of that infrastructure it's almost entirely privatized in Russia. And so this is an example of how going to the industry and the subsector level really help us understand and demystify the actual globalization trajectories of these countries. Okay, so I just want to quickly go over some of the cases. We have techno-security developmentalism in China. On one hand, we have 5G, SMIC, essentially a state-controlled semiconductor company that actually began as foreign direct investment. But corporate governance interventions over time has made it so that SMIC not only is no longer FDI, but is a state is a Chinese indigenous semiconductor company today, and is also essentially state-controlled and state-owned. But then on the other hand, we have labor-intensive sectors such as textiles that is, quite lots of indigenous private Chinese industry, FDI from, Asia, different parts of the world, and actually one of China's most marketized industries. So supra ministry that governs telecommunications. We have, yes, an array of private property, an array of property rights arrangements, but in the sectors and subsectors that are most important, the state controls or owns or sponsors the property rights arrangements. And so as a result, we have this kind of a dual strategy of import substitution via FDI, via technology transfers from foreign direct investment over time. In textiles, very open, most private, but then in the most important subsectors of textiles, which has defense applications, we see much more government intervention, much more government oversight, to a point that Chinese astronauts actually went to the moon wearing astronaut space suits made by Chinese private and state-owned technical textiles companies with Chinese state subsidies, part of the industrial policy, and so forth. But as the data here, it shows, even from 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, what we see is that this is a sector that is largely privately owned. It is China's most privatized sector. Now, just to quickly go to neoliberal self-reliance in India, as I've mentioned, because of the importance of textiles to the nationalist imagination. Here we have Modi, reenacting and really even needing the rhetoric and kind of rationalization of Gandhi cotton nationalism for his own political power. And in a democracy, right, the votes of for electoral concerns, relying on kind of these national narratives about self-reliance on one hand in the labor-intensive small-scale sectors, but on the other hand, we have telecoms, which for China and Russia are really, really important for the control of information dissemination, being one of India's most liberal sectors. Lots of foreign direct investment, lots of private Indian competition. And it's just kind of a picture, it's a telecoms regulator that regulates, of course there are spectrum scandals, there are, lots of kind of allegations between political parties about the role of politics in the allocation of spectrums, notwithstanding, it's a very, very, very competitive market, with FDI sometimes feeling like they couldn't even compete. But then we have telecoms where, because of the centralized protections to the subsector, we have handlooms and power looms, some actually quite highly polluting enterprises, small-scale enterprises that have long been subsidized and protected, despite macro liberalization and attempts at export-oriented industrialization. We have a quite centralized picture of oversight of textiles and related impacts to this industry. And so here's just some data to show that the kind of the most technologically advanced sectors and the middle sectors, a very small percentage of Indian textiles. A huge percentage comes from handlooms and power looms, which are very small scale in sectors that are highly pollutant, and but they do employ a lot of labor in India. They are important for the nationalist imagination, right? So both that objective and intersubjective perceived strategic value for the state. I want to move to Russia quickly. I mentioned already how Russell Telecoms today has, full control of telecommunications infrastructure in Russia. So this is kind of a map of the telecommunications infrastructure controlled by Russell Telecoms that never privatized after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But we have textiles where even before the fall of the Soviet Union, during perestroika and glasnost, we have textiles being actually one of the first industries that was deregulated, privatized, and liberalized by Gorbachev in the early 1980s and beyond. And to the point that actually after the fall of the Soviet Union, textiles languished for many years. And so textile enterprises were operating on very, very integrated equipment until very recently. Suddenly, after post-Crimea, import substitution became really important for Putin's rhetoric, but also for the privatized and regional and private stakeholders, some of them regional oligarchs, that then start promoting import substitution policies in textiles, whether it's defense clothing or technical sectors that have petrochemical inputs. And one really interesting finding is that some of these technical textiles, chemical processing enterprises, state-owned and privately owned by oligarchs and so forth, some of them actually now have, they get a lot of business from China. And many of this development actually occurred in the post-Crimea era and beyond, or right before it, and in the post-Georgia war and beyond. Even though, as I had mentioned earlier, for the few decades before that, the textiles industry, both the labor-intensive parts of it and the technical parts of it, were really largely left to languish and dominated by foreign direct investment until very recently. So kind of an example of how the dynamism that we do see on the objective and perceived intersubjective measures of strategic value that comes to affect patterns of market governance. And so I want to make sure that I don't go over my time here, but just quickly, I just want to kind of give a nod to implications for development. The dominant patterns of market governance that I have identified at the national and industry levels definitely have development implications, and they're not always positive ones. They can be, but not always positive. For telecoms for China, attempts at building indigenous technology has not always been successful until 5G. Right, and even with 5G, it's an interaction of state business relations, with state funding, but working with private companies like Huawei, and so Datang Huawei, Datang a state-owned enterprise, and Huawei a private enterprise, collaborated with a few other organizations. Now have some of the most some of the intellectual property for 5G. And so this dance of centralized and more decentralized market governance at this industry and subsector have been quite helpful for China in terms of developmental goals, right? And also even for security goals, right? Now have full control of information dissemination. For many years, value-added services built on top of the infrastructure owned by China Telecom, state-owned operators, and so forth, were competing in a very fierce competitive marketplace. But most recently, as many of you know, in 2020 and beyond, there's been the anti-monopoly policy and some state interventions at the corporate governance level with Alibaba and Ant Group and so forth, because suddenly these sectors are perceived quite strategic, not just for China's global economic competitiveness, but also for national security concerns about allowing private sector to have too much dominance, particularly in the most strategic sectors. So those are kind of just some examples of development outcomes and also, and also political motivations. There are a lot of implications for global conflict and cooperation of these market governance patterns that I have found at the national and industry level. Happy to answer questions during Q&A about these implications for global conflict and cooperation. Okay, and then just want to end with that, globalization pathways vary by country and sector within country, with the interacting strategic value and sectoral logics. I think quite important are the political dynamics during the founding of institutions at the industry level, and that, value-bounded rationality and institutions together shape countries' market governance and globalization trajectories with implication for development and global conflict and cooperation. So with that, I think I'm going to stop here and stop talking and get your feedback and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosie. Fascinating stuff. And I know others will chime in with questions, and I usually start off with my own. And I wonder about how the exposure to international competition the various sectors have in influencing how open or how state-controlled they are. I think back to Steph Haggard's work about development and how he argued that smaller economies that are more by necessity exposed to the international marketplace tend to liberalize in more sectors than states with large domestic markets on which to rest. Obviously, India and China both have large domestic, but I think the broader intuition is that if you really want to compete, you can't afford to have too much government control over a long period of time. You need foreign innovation, you need foreign investment, and you need to have competitive domestic situations so that you can have more successful and more marketable exports. And the second related question is whether these countries are just sui generis. They have their own domestic cultures and definitions of what's strategic and what's not, and you get very different outcomes in India and the telecommunications sector than in China and Russia because of the culture, or whether there's some learning involved across countries where they say, we don't want to do that because that looks like it hurt that industry and we want to try something else, or that country's doing well by making that innovation, maybe we want to copy it so to be competitive, or is it just really driven mostly by domestic politics in the three countries?
Thanks so much, Tom. Yeah, thank you for those questions. I think certainly, Haggard remains to be right that international markets and international competition plays important roles, and the fact that these are large developing countries with large domestic markets do in many ways give them more leeway, right? Whether it's democracy or authoritarianism, in terms of how to think about, what should we open for, competition to the global economy. So with that said, so I would answer your question kind of like in two ways. Like I think international competition matters, international markets matter, and but kind of domestic motivations and also matter. And I'd like to, I would venture to guess that, even though in this book, I look at, I compare these three countries because I can control for certain things, that the strategic value framework could be helpful even for looking at smaller countries, right? And I do think that even with smaller countries where, kind of the influence of international of the international economy, there could still be, as we mentioned, the important domestic factors and variables that might matter. And even if the sectoral variations that the strategic value framework is able to identify will not even if, but they will look different for every country. But I
Mhm.
do still think that the strategic value framework could still be helpful. In terms of the importance of international kind of economy and competition. I mean, I think one of the major reasons, take the China case, that in semiconductors, for example, that in the firm company level example that I pointed out in the talk about SMIC, one of the reasons that SMIC actually began as foreign direct investment in 2000 was because China on its own, whether it's domestic market or even indigenous innovation-wise, wasn't going to be able to create indigenous technology. And so the kind of the combination of in an industrial policy and also close collaboration with FDI, came together to create SMIC. But what's really interesting, and I think really important for market governance across time, is that, and this happened way before Xi Jinping came into power in 2013, is that by 2007, 2008, right around, and actually before the global financial crisis, there was already corporate governance interventions that was making SMIC a Chinese company. And so by corporate governance interventions, I'm referring to diluting the investment level of FDI. I'm referring to literally replacing international board members on the corporate governance board. And so by the global financial crisis, and certainly by Made in China 2020, we had an SMIC that today, if you look at popular media, is referred to as a Chinese indigenous semiconductor firm. But for those of us who have been watching, it was FDI in 2000. And in fact, when I was writing my first book and was doing interviews, going to Shanghai to interview Richard Chang, and other people, related to the company and stakeholders, it was still FDI. And so, international competition matters, and China really did take advantage of that international competition and that international exposure. And kind of segue into the second question, definitely, I think there's learning involved in many ways. I think, and the textiles example in India, where before 1990 and certainly before the 2010s, textiles was literally just closed. But there was now, they look to the East Asian developmental state model and go, we need export-oriented industrialization. We need to start opening textiles, and they do. Yet, even with that, there are these micro-level protections, and in part due to electoral interest, parties kind of claiming for it, and so forth. You have these subsidies and also exemptions. I mean, it's not so much about subsidies. It's these exemptions at the product level, even, where Indian textiles is still one of the most protected sectors in the world. I wanted to evoke Mediate, one of the CWP fellows, alumni, her work. And her work on Indian returnees, right? They certainly played a very important role in India for telecoms. And what's really interesting about that important role is that in telecommunications equipment, which was much more closed and less liberalized than services, was that at that time, Indian returnees and also Indian bureaucrats, ISA fellows that were sent to Thatcher, basically, to Thatcher, England, to be exposed to kind of ideas of Thatcherism and neoliberalism. They actually came back to India and started promoting rural infrastructure. India is a developing country. Rural telecoms infrastructure is the way to go. Well, what happened? So there was learning that going on from, Indian returnees, from Thatcherism and so forth. But guess what? They chose, in some ways, technology that was more integrated, that emphasized rural infrastructure, and in a way that Indian equipment makers actually for years were producing rural infrastructure, rural equipment, and made them less able to catch up to technological convergence and technological innovations to a point where nowadays you have Indian telecom sector associations making claims that the reason that Indian telecommunications equipment makers are slow to catch up to China is because they made the wrong bets.
Okay,
in the context of global learning.
Yeah. So Ian Johnson, the question that I was thinking about, Ian Johnson asked, and I'm always really happy when I think of the same question as Ian Johnson. I have to say, like, that's a good day. And what I was thinking is that, you explained, you didn't explain, but you described change in China. And you said, you went with the narrative that it was like 2006 with indigenous innovation when China started to turn more state-oriented, and that was if I'm putting words in your mouth, but tell me if I'm wrong. It was accelerated by the financial crisis, but it wasn't created by the financial crisis, right? It was a process that was already underway, but it was a change, right? It was a change from the earlier, more sort of cowboy capitalism reform period, and I don't really know what explains that change from a kind of deep, a constructivist, deep cultural explanation. And you seem to have one for India. You have the Gandhi spinning mill, and you have Modi on the same kind of mill, and you talk about the roots of Nehru socialism in India and how deeply it's embedded. And you just described another situation where they sent off the young Turks, whatever, to England and to study with Thatcherism, and they came back and they quickly almost enveloped by the traditional culture, and they ended up building infrastructure that looked less competitive internationally but more appropriate to the Indian cultural environment. But if the argument is a kind of deep culture argument, what's the deep culture argument for China and Russia is what Ian asked, but I add a corollary to that, which is, how do you explain the change in China? You have the same political actors in power, Chinese Communist Party, and it looks very different now than it did in 2006. It looks very different since Xi Jinping took power on things like Alibaba, which was arguably a very successful, in terms of competitiveness, a very successful model, probably China's first widely known global brand. And Xi Jinping really cracked down on it. Like, why the change if it's a cultural explanation or a national explanation? That's a long question, but I hope I did justice to it for Ian. If not, he can ask again, and he can ask it better than I did.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions, and also for Professor Johnston too for asking it as well. Yeah, you're certainly right. I did, in the talk and also just now, kind of gave more of a cultural explanation for the India case, and so in my framework, in my model, I integrate the kind of more objective materialist argument with a more constructivist one, right? And for me, and I think the reason that I came to that is because for me, it's really hard to disconnect what I call kind of value-bounded rationality, right? On one hand, it is kind of economic, materialist-driven rationality, but you do have the value-bounded rationality. And one way I treat that is I am able to, or in the empirical part, I trace it across time. So one thing I did mention in the talk is that I go to sectoral origins. And so we can focus on the China case, is that, when I go to sectoral origins, and I look at textiles and telecoms, I start from actually, believe it or not, I go way back to post-Opium War and that opening to kind of international exposure. Really, one of in modern contemporary Chinese history, that major exposure to the outside world. And I see that, kind of in the beginnings of mechanized telecoms and mechanized textiles, where we have British and Japanese investment into nationalist China, well, during the Qing dynasty and the nationalist China, and you see the beginnings of textiles investment. And actually some of the early Chinese Communist Party mobilization, right, before Mao came along and emphasized on the peasants, was in response to some of that early investment and kind of what was happening in the city centers, right, in Tianjin or in Shanghai. And so in the book, I make this argument that that early, maybe seemingly objective kind of response to perception of the importance of, China needing to be, big and strong and be able to respond to kind of the outsiders.
Yeah.
That early exposure then become over time a perception about national insecurity, about the importance of national development.
There's a
And
Fuguo
so,
Changding, that kind of thing, right?
yes, yeah. Yeah, and I make the argument that you see that you're able to trace that even across different types of regimes, right? Whether it's Qing dynasty or the nationalist Chinese, and then of course Mao Zedong. And then for the Mao Zedong, what's interesting is that the conventional wisdom is that during the Cultural Revolution, everything was kind of decentralized and kind of demobilized. But in fact, in the Third Front, we saw investments in telecommunications infrastructure and actually even technical textiles. And so that's how I treat kind of the national, the kind of the ebbs and flows or in response to internal and external pressures across time. And that's where I bring in, or at least that's my story of how culture evolved. And that culture of believing in this national narrative of national insecurity and the importance of national technological development. And of course, you're going to have leaders like Deng Xiaoping who are going to emphasize more. Well, in order to get that national technological development, we're going to have to liberalize. And then you're going to have Xi Jinping that comes along. Obviously, there's some personal motivations, but also, building on what already been in existence, which is, political legitimacy and political development is going to be really critical during this era. And so I that's how I hope that is a good answer to how I explain kind of the interaction between more objective and intersubjective measures of thinking about kind of that cultural change and strategic value over time.
Okay, thanks. I'm gonna let Daniel take over the questions, and I'm gonna have to, Rosie, I'm gonna have to bow out in about 10 minutes to go to another event, and I wanted to thank you before I do. It's just really great to have you back.
Thank you so much.
The program values loyalty to the program, and you seem like you're one of our loyal friends in the greater Northeast area. So
thank you so much. Learned a lot from
welcome back.
the program too. So
Temple's not very far away.
Over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Tom. So we have another question from one of this year's fellows from Hongjiang, who is actually in the question box if you want to follow along while I read it. Just, it seems China's techno-security developmentalism was critically enabled by a relatively friendly international environment where Western firms were willing to invest in the high-tech sectors in China, but later they found that technologies, quote, appropriated by China's pro-indigenous innovation policies. This kind of relationship with FDI seems to have fundamentally changed in the past decade. Is China nowadays capable of growing genuinely indigenous innovation without having to selectively collaborate with FDI first? Follow-up question, what is the implications for China's FDI policies going forward?
Yeah, thank you so much, Hong Zhang, for that for that question. I think it's a very important question. These are important questions, and in some ways, it's hard to predict into the future. I mean, obviously, what we have seen and what I found in even in my first book, is that globalization and that ability to garner foreign direct investment in some ways, in ways that that India and Russia weren't able to, right? But one of the reasons why textiles was left to languish in Russia, despite that openness since even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, was FDI was not going in to Russia in those sectors. Even for India, telecommunications, there's a lot of foreign competition, but they found it really difficult to operate in India's, market environment. And so in many ways, China have very much benefited from the fact that that foreign direct investment was willing to go into China, even as China strategically, accorded FDI in kind of the most high-tech sectors. And so, with the, kind of increasing re-regulation that we've seen over time since 2013 for sure, and as in my earlier work, I really seen kind of some of these dominant patterns in strategic and non-strategic sectors, kind of over time as well. I think it is a very important question. Is China going to really capable of indigenous innovation? I think the Chinese government at the state, at the kind of very top level, would like to think that's a possibility. I think that, but I also think that we're not seeing the end of FDI. I do think that there are global capital very ready to return to China, and also not even just to return to China, they actually never left China. Like they, are willing to kind of stick it out, and willing to invest in areas that the Chinese government would like to continue to court. And so, that bifurcated picture that I find in my work, it's a large part of the economy that is still quite, open to to FDI and to private investment as well. And what we're going to see is that some of that foreign capital may not come in the form of direct investment, but may come in the form of equity investment, or just collaborations with Chinese companies abroad. So I think perhaps the form of FDI will look different, but I do definitely think there might be some pride and a belief that China is capable of indigenous innovation. Now, is that in fact true? I think that there's a debate out there, right? I think there's a debate out there among political scientists, political economists, but also engineers and scientists who actually know the substantive of kind of content of that innovation. And so I think it is a debate out there, but I do believe that this is not the end of FDI. And the Chinese market is so big that just from my fieldwork across time, I find that despite all that re-regulation, despite all those restrictions, there are a lot of FDI just kind of eager to invest in China, and for better or for worse, in terms of of their market scope and investment returns, in fact. So I hope that answers at the kind of more predictive question.
It's certainly been talked a lot over the recent time how much all of these things might have changed from COVID and a number of other factors in recent years, and it's really hard to try to figure out exactly how all this is going to shape out in the future. But certainly FDI, even if it may change, it's not going to doesn't seem to be significantly leaving sectors that have previously been engaged in or made money in over the last several decades. So it'll be an interesting space. Another question from another one of our audience members. It's a bit more of a general question. How may all of these, the examination of your three countries, how many of that have been impacted by the regime change or the regime of each of the, I guess specifically from India, the democracy, how did the democracy and, being more subjected to its constituencies, how did that play into some of your research?
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions. So for India, the electoral motive really, plays an important role. I think the path dependency of, the kind of the sectoral organization of institutions in textiles, for example, play an important role, right? Over time, these protectionist policies have benefited, certain constituents, right? Handlooms and powerlooms, to a point where you have politicians, in the various parties, whether it's the BJP or the Congress Party or more regional parties, state parties, catering to constituents that want to see the continuities of of exemptions and protections for these products and for market segments and industries, and so that's where the electoral motive does become important, and which is why it does, and to a point where you see impacts where you start seeing large scale mills, right? The more mechanized, technologically advanced mills, many of these mills actually invest in handlooms and power looms. In a way that's almost, it almost doesn't make sense technologically, but it makes sense economically, because it's the handlooms and the power looms that are dominant, and so you have large scale mills even getting into the action here, and so the regime type certainly played a role. And in terms of authoritarian regime type being important, is that industrial policy, right? It's not always easy to implement and execute. And at least in the most critical product categories and subsectors, China has certainly, as an authoritarian country, an inability to mobilize investment and mobilize state capacity in areas that are most important, have enabled the authoritarian regime to even build indigenous capacity in semiconductors, which 2 or 3 decades ago, just not even possible. So just examples of importance of regime type in the story.
So Ian Johnson had a follow-up question. He says, since Tom stole my first question, here's a follow-up. India and China have both had colonial histories. In the China case, as you noted, this memory seems to have led to a rich state, strong army vision of development. Is the Indian vision or imagination also a rich state, strong army vision with Indian characteristics? If not, why not? And which historical memory has mattered most in the Russian case?
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Johnston, for those questions. So I would say that for India, it's not so much rich state, strong army, but to kind of the imagination of the importance of rural sectors, of small scale sectors, and so neoliberal self-reliance, right? Like this idea that India being this large developing country with large labor base, large rural population, India can rely on itself, right? Part of the Gandhi's mobilization of cotton nationalism was that during British colonialism, particularly after World War I and in between, before World War II, you have this idea that what was being manufactured in Manchester was being exported to India and competing with what India does best, which is textiles and cotton textiles, and so Gandhi really taking into account India's rural population and small scale industry in alliance with India, large, kind of more larger industrialists together formed the National Congress Party. And the whole idea was, wow, if I have to make it kind of similar to rich state, strong army, it would probably be, rich, strong, perhaps strong society, or self-reliant society, and self-reliant society and rich state, something like that. But the importance of ideas being important too, during the neoliberal era, comes into effect, which is why with my strategic value framework, I identify India's model as neoliberal self-reliance. Also, the question about Russia, the idea that, resources and infrastructure being really important, and also security, right? In the strategic value framework, I identify resource security nationalism as really important in the kind of the strategic value orientation of Russia. And so what we see is that to be true even during the military industrial complex, but and also since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so security continues to be quite important, to a point where, as I've said, they didn't know what to do with telecommunications infrastructure. And it was not privatized. It was decentralized, but not privatized at the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so that's the strategic value orientation for Russia.
Gotcha. As a follow-up, I think you're going to be hard-pressed to find countries that aren't interested in sort of a rich state or a wealthy state sort of context. But the point is well taken. You mentioned before that sometimes you'll run across industries like the looms where they will still invest in manual looms as opposed to maybe upgrading to a technologically more suitable or advanced option. So I guess there's another question from the audience that sort of trends on this. About the recent reversal by Modi for agricultural opening up. Is this more of a conversation that would fit into that model of maybe not necessarily being the most, strictly speaking, what we would consider the best in terms of development or technological advancement? Maybe it makes the most economic sense, or is that a bad way to sort of understand how that unfolded?
Yeah, thank you for those questions and how might apply to other sectors in India. And I think agriculture, rural sectors, these are all really important sectors for labor and employment in India. So there is the kind of the more materialist kind of objective value dimension of kind of reversing the opening of the agricultural sector. But there's also the kind of self-reliance, right? Like that's kind of as a self-reliance and kind of more protectionist, almost re-regulation that Modi has been doing, right? The idea of made in India policies of the last several years would also be examples. And that would fit well into understanding some of these empirical developments that have unfolded, and the strategic value framework in identifying neoliberal self-reliance, and that intermix of liberalization and re-regulation and at the sector level, I think would explain some of the even very recent developments.
Of course, yeah. Last question, and I think we have to let you go, as Tom would say, for human rights reasons, as we get close to 6 p.m. People have other things to do. I appreciate you giving us the time that you have thus far. I don't totally understand this question, so I'm going to try to summarize it as best I can. Speaking to sort of external pressures, but obviously also internal pressures, how does that fit into sanctions and other aspects of countries, specifically these three, sort of communicating with each other? And would a more broader range of sanctions versus more targeted ones that have currently been sort of applied have more of a overreaching impact in terms of how we're seeing international relations play out in the current environment?
Yeah, thank you so much for the sanctions question. And actually what's really interesting, and it's in the book, is that, during, obviously post-Crimea in 2014 and beyond, there were sanctions. And a lot of those sanctions were in some ways almost too targeted, to individuals and even individual oligarchs. And did not target certain sectors that perhaps could have been quite important to sanction. And even today, there are certain exemptions of areas, right? Like in oil and petrochemicals and so forth. And so So on one hand, those sanctions were very targeted, continue to, I mean, much more comprehensive today, as President Biden has described them, but still continue to be somewhat targeted, right? And this is true for American or European responses to what Russia has been doing intervention-wise in Crimea and Ukraine. But the sanctions and the idea of sanctions, what it did in post-2014 was that it mobilized a lot of industry and sector stakeholders, and Putin himself and his allies, to actually, I mentioned in the talk about import substitution industrialization policies in sectors that the Russian government really had kind of ignored for years. Well, a lot of those policies were implemented and executed as a response to mobilization for those policies in response to sanctions. And so instead of really hurting the kind of macro Russian economy, the sanctions at that time, the targeted nature of those sanctions at that time, actually mobilized ISI policies. And so what can we take away from that? Well, I guess what we can take away from that is that I think it's for sanctions to work, I think it is important to actually really understand and disaggregate the economy and see, and understand what's happening on the ground. And I think that it's also really important to target the sanctions in ways that are that will actually lead to the effects that we wanted to see, right? We want sanctions to actually cripple the economy. But instead it mobilized, at least in the 2014 beyond period, state intervention in certain sectors. And at least in technical textiles and in petrochemical input sectors, we actually seen strength in the Russian government. They found new markets in countries like China and beyond. They strengthened sectors that previously had been actually dominated by FDI. And so those are just kind of some of the empirical developments that have occurred because of the way the sanctions were calibrated. This is not to say that sanctions are not an important tool it's not an important tool for international relations, but it's just that we have to really think about and carefully calibrate the content of the sanctions.
Gotcha. No, of course, it's an evolving situation.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been wonderful getting to talk with you. I guess Tom already took off to his next event, but we'll be looking forward to when this book comes out, which is when again, end of May, early June, you said?
Yes, end of May, early June is when CUP promises that it's coming out.
Yeah.
But it's available for pre-order, so.
So go online and get this book. It's obviously going to be very, very important. We thank you once again for your time, and to everyone else, we have another event next Monday. And in the meantime, have a wonderful weekend.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful questions. Bye-bye.
Bye.